This morning, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research, especially those on working memory and how they relate to math achievement. Now, when Bella's first talked to me about giving a talk here, my immediate thought was, well, I don't really do very much on mental health. But when I looked into it, there's actually quite a bit of work looking at the relationship between educational attainment and mental health, especially looking at socioeconomic status and mental health. And in fact, there is a recent study published in Psychological Science that looks at how achievement in mathematics is closely related to SES, which is indirectly related to mental health. So probably indirectly, children's achievement in mathematics early on, grades age 7 is about grade 1, is related to mental health later. Just exactly where the pathways is unknown. But my work has focused on Singapore children's achievement. As many of you may know, Singapore does very well in mathematics, international comparisons of mathematics, and has regularly come at the top. But having said that, there is also a relatively large tail end compared to other high-performing countries. So the proportion of children who do relatively poorly is somewhat larger in Singapore compared to places like Shanghai and Taiwan. So each year, around 5 to 6% of children struggle with mathematics on entry to primary school. All children are screened for numeracy difficulties when they enter school, and they're also screened for language difficulties as well. And there's a large degree of overlap in children who have difficulties in math and in English. Now, in some informal survey of difficulties associated with math overseas, it was found that within adults, this percentage is quite large. 20% of adults in the US seems to have difficulty figuring out store discount. In the UK, a recent survey found that about half the adults have difficulties that can be solved by 10-year-olds. So one of my interests is to look at individual differences in math performance, and in terms of sources of variation, we can divide the sources of variation into those that can be attributed to the system versus those that can be attributed to individual differences. In terms of system-based differences, we have things like societal expectation coming into play. So in Confucius-based societies, there is a tendency for parents to attribute success to the amount of work children put in. So parents, one hears parents say, put in a bit more work and you'll be okay next time, whereas in some Western cultures, there's a tendency to attribute math failures to abilities. Now, the education also has a role to play here. The amount of time devoted to mathematics in primary and in secondary school. The quality of teachers is also very important. In parts of China, for example, even primary school math teachers are specialized math teachers. Even in Singapore, we don't have that. In primary schools, math teachers are generalists, and they generally teach a range of subjects. Curriculum content is also important in terms of the structuring of mathematics, and some of my work is on that area, but I won't be talking about that this morning. Now, what I want to talk about this morning specifically is on individual differences, in particular some of the cognitive underpinnings of differences in mathematics. Now, one of the constructs that I've been working with is called working memory. Working memory is not just memory. It's not just short-term memory, but it's, as the term suggests, putting memory to work. So what you're doing now is working your working memory very hard. Why is that? Now, understanding speech is tough because you have to remember what I said a couple of seconds ago, right? So there's a memory aspect to it. But you're also constantly accessing your mental lexicon, trying to map particular words, particular sounds to particular meanings. So there's processing of information. And that is a hallmark of working memory. Working memory is really about processing information and remembering information simultaneously. So it differs from simple short-term memory in that with simple short-term memory, you're really just remembering. If I give you my telephone number, 9323-0123, all you have to do in order to remember that is to rehearse that over and over again until you can write it down or something. There's very little semantic processing involved, unlike working memory. So working with working memory, my colleague Rebecca Bull did some seminal work in this area, and she showed that with young children at least, a particular measure of working memory predicts early math performance very well. Using standardized working memory scores, Susan Gatherco in the UK found that she could explain mathematical performance in standardized tests with about 83% accuracy. So it seems to be quite a useful measure. And when I first started work on this, almost a decade ago now, Singapore still had a very early streaming system. So for those of you who remember primary school back in the early 2000s, children used to be streamed into EM1, EM2, and EM3 at the end of, I think, primary 4. And that decision is based almost completely on the academic performance. And what we wanted to do at that time was to see if there are other measures that can allow us better access to the potentials of children. So what comes to mind immediately are measures of intelligence. But when we talked to our ministry colleagues about that, it soon became clear that the notion of intelligence has too much baggage to it. And it's quite difficult to use that in a system-wide basis. So we're searching around for alternative constructs that give us the same amounts of bang for our bucks, and working memory was something we looked at. So in a number of studies now, we found that working memory predicts performance, math performance very well. In 2 studies, we found that we explained about 25% of individual differences in math performance. And since then, there's been a meta-analysis done on this literature and worldwide, and the amount of variance explained by working memory in terms of academic performance is about a quarter of the individual differences. So we're quite confident that what we have found is replicable, but what we were a little bit uncomfortable about was that much of the evidence that is available is correlational in nature. So as you can imagine, when you go into the field, it's not immediately clear how we can randomly assign children to different working memory capacity groups. So we need to take them as they come. Similarly, with math performance, they are either good or bad at math, unless you spend a lot of time with them. So we found a way to reduce working memory access in a laboratory setting, and we found that by reducing access to working memory capacity, children's accuracy in math performance is greatly reduced. So that gives us some confidence that what has been found on a correlational basis does have some causal mechanism behind it. Now, with our most recent study, we have expanded our previous studies, which tended to be cross-sectional in nature and focused on primary 5 children. We've expanded that into a very long-range longitudinal study. We use a cross-cohort design and examine children that range from kindergarten 2, so this is about 5 years of age, all the way to grade 9, so this is about 13 years of age, so secondary 3. And each year, we measured children's working memory capacity, inhibitory and switching capacity. So these are other aspects of what we call executive functioning. Inhibitory abilities refers to children's ability to not attend to irrelevant information. switching, being able to think fluently and to switch from one cognitive operation to another. So we had a full suite of executive functioning measures, and we tracked the growth of that, and we also looked at the qualitative differences in executive functioning as children matured. And on the right-hand side, we also looked at mathematical achievement, going from basic numeracy to arithmetic to algebra. So the study took us quite a long time to do. The children were very pleased at the end of the study, finally see the back of us, because each time we saw them for about 5 hours, not all in the same time. So we usually spread testing over about 5 to 6 days. With the older kids, they are quite glad to be out of the classroom, but with primary 1 kids, we were quite surprised that they didn't want to leave the classroom at all. So I suppose that speaks volume for our educational system. Now, so what do we find here? In terms of concurrent cross-sectional relations, we replicated the literature, and we found that the correlation ratio between working memory capacity and mathematical achievements as measured by a standardized math test was really very high, especially at grade 1. So the correlation ratio was about 0.65, so accounting for about 40% of individual differences. And it remains high at grade 2. It drops slightly at grade 3 and remains high thereafter. So the only somewhat lower correlation was with kindergarten. Now this was quite interesting, and in terms of kind of if one is looking at intervention, what it suggests is that there really isn't a bad time to do intervention if one is focusing on improving working memory. But the early grades in terms of primary 1 and primary 2 probably offers a somewhat better opportunity. Now, we also looked at the data from a predictive or longitudinal perspective. So we fitted Markov chains to the data. And what is quite interesting here is that working memory has a consistent predictive effect on math performance the year later. If you look at these regression coefficients, you'll notice that they are exactly the same. You might think that, hey, come on, exactly the same. So we actually fitted different models to it. In one model, we allow these coefficients to vary freely, and another model, this particular model, we fixed them to be exactly the same, and we tested the model fits across the two models. And what we found was that regardless of whether they're freed or whether they're fixed to the same value, the model fits were very similar. So suggesting that a fixed predictive value is a good explanation for what we observed in the data. So long story short, working memory seems to have a consistent predictive effect on math performance 1 year later. What does change is the influence of previous math achievements. So we were thinking, well, when you use math performance in 1 year to predict math performance the next year, it will stand to reason that you'll have a very high correlation. And by and large, that is the case. But what was surprising was that with the early age groups in particular, these are unstandardized parameters. But when we looked at the standardized parameters, when we looked at these early age groups, what we found was that the influence of working memory was higher than that of previous math performance. So regardless of how well children did the year before, as long as they have high working memory capacity, they'll do well the year later. This is true for the earlier grades, but not true for later grades. So as children grow older, the impact or the influence of previous math performance increased. Now this perhaps stands to reason in that if you look at your latest calculus handout, if you haven't done calculus before, if you haven't done algebra before, you probably won't get it, right? You won't even understand the notation. Whereas basic numeracy, there are arguments that basic numeracy is something that comes naturally to us. We can demonstrate numeracy effect not only in humans, but in monkeys and in other species as well. So it's perhaps the case that with earlier mathematics, in terms of early numeracy, it is something that is very closely related to general cognitive development, working memory being one of them. But as we impose upon those early capabilities additional constructed knowledge, those constructed knowledge really need to be learned. Otherwise, you just won't be able to do the task. In addition to just looking at working memory, we've also been focusing on another aspect of children's development, and that is motivation. I haven't done much motivation work in the past. This is really my first endeavor looking at it. And what we did in this study was to look at how children approach school, how children approach academic performance. So in the motivation literature, people talk about mastery goals and performance goals. Mastery goals are really about doing the academic work because you're interested in it, because you want to do well for knowledge's sake, right? You're not doing it for competition. Whereas performance goal is exactly about that. You want to do well because you want to beat the next guy, because you want to get that reward from your parents later on, because you want to get praise from your teacher. So that's performance goal. Now, what has been found in the literature, and this is quite well established, is that if you have high performance goal, you're just focusing on that reward later on, in the long term, you don't tend to do as well in terms of academic achievement. Whereas if you're focusing on intrinsic learning, if you're interested in the subject, you will tend to do better long term. So we replicated that. But what is interesting is that we only replicated that kind of effect with children who had low working memory. Right? So children who had high performance goal and low mastery goal had the worst performance, whereas children who had high performance goal but also high mastery goal didn't do as badly. But look at what happens as working memory capacity increases. You have a smaller fan effect, and as we go to children with high working memory, we almost have no differences. The performance goals really didn't make any difference anymore. So we interpreted this effect as working memory having a protective effect on the negative effect of performance goal. Now, I hope I've shown that working memory is a construct that is useful both for predicting mathematics performance and also important in terms of being a explanatory variable for individual differences in math achievement. So the big question is, if working memory is that important, is there some way in which we can improve it? So we have made some endeavors in this area. When we looked at the literature, we found that there are already quite a few commercially available products out there. There's one called CogMat from the Karolinska Institute, and there's another one that is based in the US that's advertises very heavily, I hear. But the problem is that these tools are very expensive, and most of the children with difficulties in working memory come from relatively poor background. So we wanted to work out something locally that would be available to children here, and this is one of the 8 games that we came up with. So the story here is that the post bear is a very keen postman, and all he wants to do when he was posted to this alien planet is to deliver his mail. Right? But the locals are very curious and want to interact with him. He doesn't particularly want to, so he pushes them away, skips under them, jump over them, and this is the kind of game parts that children tend to like. It's like a simple platform game. They get to control what the post bear do. But then you see the triangle coming up, All right, that's a sign for the children to start remembering the identity of the aliens. So they're given instructions beforehand that after playing for a little while, they need to start remembering who they push aside. And they're given a test later on, so which is the last alien that they encountered, which is the second last. And the number of aliens they're asked to remember increases as the game progressed. And the rate of progression is individually adaptive. So if the child is doing very well, then difficulty increased more quickly. If they are having difficulties, then the game remained at the same level. So we made it more challenging by making the game individually adaptive. Now, we had different versions of this. Some are based on the same continuous performance paradigm. Others are based on what's called a keep track paradigm, both of which are targeted to exercise children's updating capacity. Updating is very closely related to working memory. Now, the results, we compared our findings with those from a ministry study that looked at the efficacy of CogMed. This is the one from the Karolinska Institute that I told you about. Now, I haven't got a slide here, but I have to say CogMed performed incredibly well for visual spatial memory. The graph was something like basically off the page, at least at the end of intervention. But at the 6-month post-test, so we pre-tested the children. We gave them intervention, and the intervention occurred over one term, which is about 10 weeks, and children received 25 sessions. Each session was about half an hour playing with the games. And we tested them after the cessation of intervention, and then we gave 6 months, and we have a delayed post-test. So with CogMed, they did very well on the visual spatial working memory measures right at the end of intervention, but the performance returned back to baseline at the post-test. Now, with our results, we got some improvement at the end of intervention, not a huge increase, but that improvement was maintained across the 6-month post-test period. So we were encouraged by these findings, but what we were very discouraged about was that this improvements in working memory didn't translate into gains in mathematical performance. And this is a pattern that has been found in other studies overseas as well. Now, it's unclear just exactly why there is such poor transfer, because if we look at previous studies, both correlational and experimental, we do find a very strong relationship between working memory capacity and math performance. So is it just that these interventions are rubbish and they're just training monkeys to do the same thing over and over again? It's not really improving working memory at a deeper level, wherever that is. Now that's a possibility, but we're not quite giving up yet. We're going to give it another shot. In one previous study, what we found was that children who have comorbidity difficulties in both mathematics and in English tend to have a more have poorer working memory capacity than the counterparts with just difficulties in math. So in a new study, which was just approved 2 weeks ago, what we proposed to do was to look at children with different etiology. So those who have only difficulties in mathematics, those who have difficulties in math and English, with difficulties in math and working memory, and difficulties in all 3 areas. We'll look at those 4 groups, and all these 4 groups will be drawn from children from the Learning Support Program in mathematics, and we will design 3 different kinds of intervention. So the non-numeric working memory intervention that I've shown you before, we'll be using a numeracy intervention from our collaborator at Leuven, and we'll also design a new intervention that has both numeracy as well as working memory components in it. But what is key to this is that as children do the working memory task, we make the numeracy aspect obligatory. so that they really have to do numeracy as well as working memory at the same time. And again, we'll use a multiple time points evaluation. So if you have this symposium again next year, I hope to be able to come back and give you some good news, but until then. Now, my time is running out, so let me just give you some take-home. And one thing that I think I can reliably say is that working memory is a reliable predictor of math achievement, both on a cross-sectional basis as well as on a longitudinal basis. And the relation between working memory and math achievement seems to be of a causal nature, although the ultimate test is whether you can improve working memory and then get a positive effect in math achievements, and that hasn't been achieved yet. Now, some of you may be interested in, well, okay, I'm convinced if we want to use working memory as a measure, either for clinical practices or for educational purposes, what can we do? Now, there are standardized tests out there. So there's one called the Working Memory Test Battery for Children by Susan Gathico and Sue Pickering. That one is relatively well used. We have used it in Singapore, and even though they're not population, well, it's close to population norms, but we're also running another study in which more norms will be made available. And we are also using what's called updating task, and we've used this for children from kindergarten all the way to the middle of secondary schools already, and have quite a bit of data on this. So all of these tasks have shown to be reliable and have good psychometric properties. And these ones you have to buy. This one you can get from our website. So I think I'm out of time. So if you have some questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.